Coots Paradise was a landing, a meeting place where different cultures came together, traded, carried on, took fish for food.
Like Champlain and
even
those people?
Champlain coming into this area for one of his journeys in 1612, and so that's actually where you get the first written record.
Land surveying, right?
Just exploring trade routes,
Right.
new lands, places they hadn't been.
For me, walking through here, it's a sanctuary. And for many years, that's what I would do, just walk through here and enjoy it immensely. But as you walk through, or as I walked through, I began to notice different aspects of it. And I was writing a lot about it. And so while writing about it, I came to know it very well. And then my imagination kicks in and I start to feel perhaps the marshes have their own imagination. Hello, welcome back to episode 3 of Tales of Paradise Marsh. I have with me today my guest, Thysmeyer. He's the Director of Land and Water at the RBG. It's a pleasure, honor for me to have Thysmeyer here today, and the reason why has to do, one, with his 40 years at the RBG, and to let you know something really quite amazing. This is the man who discovered the spill, the 24 billion liter spill in Chinook Canal, 2018. I'll let him tell the story, but I am so pleased to have him on, and I think we'll all learn from him about this watershed, the wetlands, and the marsh. Thank you so much for coming, Thys.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
You know, I think the first thing is to tell me what it is you're doing. You have a job title, give me that, but what does that entail? Like, it's such a large scope that you take under your wing as a steward of that marsh.
So if I was to describe my job, it's a combination of environmental restoration and stewardship combined with creating the opportunity for people to have experiences in a natural environment. Overall, the Royal Botanical Gardens property spans a length of about 10 kilometers, one way up and down the lake, 4 kilometers wide up onto the escarpment. It is semi-contiguous, but it has roads and highways through it, many of which we all travel. And so you have fragmentation issues and wildlife challenges getting across roads, people getting across roads, all the same. And so we have lands that are intact, part of an original nature reserve from 1927. It took a designation. Most of the lands of the RBG are part of the nature reserve, so it's sort of 95% big open green space environmental protection area and 5% formal gathering places called gardens. So my job is to continue the legacy of people who set this up.
When you talk about the roadways, do you mean, say, we can talk about Plains Road, we can talk about Ancaster, we can talk about Main Street and highway corridors, like these roadways and transits you're speaking of? I know that they're complicated land masses that have divided up the RBG, you're saying.
Yes. What would we say? The tip of the lake, well, it's where wildlife and birds concentrate. It's also where people concentrate. It's a crossroads. That's the best way to say it. And out of that crossroads is born what actually is a National Historic Site also. So all of the Royal Botanical Gardens is a National Historic Site. The roads, well, they were once indigenous canoes and pathways, and then they graduated to horses and carts, and then they graduated to also railways, and then they graduated to two-way highways, and then they graduated to 6-lane highways. And so we have all of those layered on this spot, which means people are still using it the way they always have. They just have much bigger vehicles. And those roads now become barriers that isolate wildlife and people from the other parts.
So yeah, instead of trail as access, it's trail as barrier. Mm-hmm. Or road as barrier and another. Yes, I mean, the metaphors are big and real. You know, these tracks, these road transits, Indigenous pathways. Could you say a bit about that?
I'm always learning. It's quite a journey of discovery for all of us. But the question always was, well, who was here before me? What were they doing? What were they doing 300 years ago, 400 years ago? And so you arrive pretty quickly at Coots Paradise was a landing, a meeting place where different cultures came together, traded, carried on, took fish for food. The one that has considerable documentation that is hidden is the neutrals. So they were noted by Jesuits who came first attempting to bring Christian culture from the French side into the interior.
Would that be the 18th century, like 1750, 60 area?
We're actually going back as far as the first ones are, say, 1630, 1620 even. There was a quick little pass. You have
like Champlain and
even
those people?
Champlain coming into this area for one of his journeys in 1612. And so that's actually where you get the first written record.
Land surveying, right?
Just exploring trade routes,
Right.
new lands, places they hadn't been. And and so you do pick up stories if you can find these 1650 documents, which are actually called the Jesuit Relations now. They're all summarized, 43 volumes. That's a lot of tomes to sift through.
Wow.
But equally, you have archaeological digs spearheaded by McMaster University professors, which discover the villages. So because the land was so fertile in this region, so not full of rock, even though we have the escarpment, the culture called the neutrals, which was how Champlain termed it, because they held the peace between, to the north, the Wendat, also sometimes called the Huron, and to the south and east, the Five Nations, but the Seneca being the closest. They were the sort of the territory where you could meet in the middle and you had to behave yourself. And they were able to hold that because they held the best resources, and thus they were the most powerful of the bunch. But the neutrals disappeared, and so our knowledge of them disappeared. They only lasted until the 1650s.
Wow. The summary of Western colonization and just that description. I want to know that whether that legacy you are maintaining in your role here in this century and at this time, the restorative efforts you are undertaking since 2014 towards a time that the spill occurred in Hamilton, the 24 billion liters of sewage leaking from an overflow tank, missing not spotted for 4 years. You came upon that. But before you reached that Shadok Canal spillage toxic center, you had worked for years. Can you tell us something about the restorative efforts you have undertaken with other stakeholders in the Bay before we talk directly about the spill that you encountered?
Certainly. And interestingly enough, 2014-15 was the pinnacle of the restorative effort for the past 70 years. So it really started in the late 1940s is really when it started. So that's well before my time, with others out of McMaster and out of the community, out of RBG.
I must interject there. They looked at it in the 40s, say early 50s, because the pollution was becoming so great, or because, why did they begin looking then?
The initiative in the 40s was a consequence to the sudden and rapid decline of the marshland system that everybody had known. It had been quite injured and damaged at the mouth of Shadok for a very long time. Stories over there go back as far as the 1860s with concerns over the water quality and the health of the fish and the ability to not come away sick as a visitor. That's a long-standing one, but the larger marsh didn't come apart until the 1940s, and so that is when a great community initiative to even understand what was behind it was undertaken, which led to the beginnings of efforts to stem the decline in the 1950s. The scale of it was overwhelming, and it was almost like you could say it was abandoned through the 60s because of the land use change on the watershed that was just continually sending down sediment and pollution. And it wasn't until the 70s that you even started to see a change, but at the same time, the marsh was still declining because it still had remnants of the old system. It just took time for the pollution to eat away at the marsh bit by bit, so it chewed it back from a 3-kilometer long marsh system to lose a few meters each year you're down to a 1/4 kilometer of marsh by basically 1990.
In that 70s to 80s, 90s, how toxic, could you measure the toxicity? Like, I have a picture of black lagoons. I have a picture of, green scum across the face of the marsh forever. Plumes of smoke and methane. What did a dark period look like, given the industrial and upstream lack of knowledge around what they were letting loose into the environment, etc.? And let's say it was ignorance at that time of the real, true consequences of their practices.
What we are familiar with and we think of now, actually, that kind of pollution was removed from Cootes Paradise, other than Shidok, mostly by I would even say the 1940s.
Wow.
And that's because the power that supplied the industry was formerly the water power of Big Spencer Creek, but that shifted to the coal power and moved it to where the large ships could dock. And so it shifted to the harbor downstream of Cootes Paradise. But on Shidok, certainly industry remained up until the 1970s, and
Right.
the last remnants, I think, of industry still hung on in Dundas, which is on Spencer Creek, until the 1970s. So most of the pollution of the last 50 years has been in the form of sewage, untreated and variably treated, from that community that built itself up, that then worked over in the industrial area. So most of it is thus algae, and that spawns from sewage, because sewage is just fertilizer in the end, most of it.
Thys, I did hear, this is what I heard, that you are the person. You are the person who actually reported it to the officials, the civic officials, city councilors, the environment. You came upon that spill, and you were the one who, I guess that would be a whistleblower.
I am the one who actually made the call that caused the wheels to finally turn. It was on July, I believe, 2nd. It was in the heat of summer, right around the long weekend. After getting various reports of concerning situations up in that region, which it's not unusual. That's been the way it's been for years. It's been inching forward, but it's always concerning. I decided these reports seemed to string together enough information that someone needed to go look. In 2014, the western half of the marsh was extraordinarily recovered, and so we were celebrating that part of it, and we were still concerned about the Shidok area, but there was so much to celebrate elsewhere. And then you saw the Shidok effect start to find its way into that restored area. And so in 2018, that is when it really went down. Really, that's when the spill had its
Like a
worst
precipitous...
effect. Precipitous. So the spring would have started often, as it does, with massive blooms of algae as the marsh tries to heal itself and grow new life. Algae is the quickest and first to grow. That occurred in abundance that spring. People were concerned about it, but it wasn't unusual. By the time you started getting some water samples in, you were finding some highly variable conditions from, well, the same as Shidok had been for years, to some that were extreme and representative of a tank that spills, which the tank that holds the sewage does spill when it rains enough. And so you couldn't really tease out. So I went up in a boat. I actually couldn't even reach the end of the creek by water from RBG side because the sewage was so thick. I took pictures and I went right back and started contacting everyone to say the community cannot come near this water. It is not safe, and we have to find out where it is. Finding out where it is not so easy because it disappears underground into a big cavern of concrete and pipes into darkness. And so it could be anywhere in the next kilometer underground, under the highway.
And now, once it's discovered, what happens then, and how do they respond to you? The city, the councils, the environment ministries, etc. And the people of Hamilton, really, once known.
It's a combination of things because there's two levels to the story. Certainly the information into the ward councillor's office, because that's the representative for the community, and I expected they would be able to help, knowing the right people in the city to contact. That went immediately. It went very well.
So Adian Johnson we're speaking of?
We're talking about Councillor Aidan Johnson.
He would have received, Ward 1 councillor would have received information, and he quickly acted on that to send it through his channels?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is exactly how it transpired.
Yeah. So that's good news, right?
That's great news, and it engaged public health right from the get-go,
Right.
and that actually was the strong driver behind improving this and recovering and finding what is the source of this problem.
Right.
That led to a series of contractors being hired by the city as well as city staff, and actually going into the pipes with headlamps and walking up this buried creek that is Shadoke to just figure out where in this kilometer of underground was the water leaking in from. And it took about 2 weeks of investigations, and the source was found, which was a gate operating incorrectly on the biggest combined sewer overflow holding tank for sewage in the whole city, and so it had been just flowing out the bottom. It was made worse by the fact that while the gate on the holding tank was open, an actual second gate had broken that was a regular sewer line, and so the sewer was spilling into the tank. The tank would have caught it, but the outlet was open, and so it was just flowing through the tank. So that was easy to fix, close the tank.
24 billion liters later.
The 24 billion came as a great surprise, a year and a half later? We knew there was a spill.
Right.
You didn't know
at that
the spill had been going on for months and years, and so that was where the shock sort of hit you after that.
There was a great silence that I found when the councillors finally did respond. There seemed to be... They did get into action. They acted upon the ministry's suggestions. What did you feel about I would say the silence of everyone on council around the issues that you were bringing forward?
It was a challenge, of course, I would say, right? You're working in a place where you're under the impression everybody is working up to get a handle on the old sewage problems, get them cleaned up, work together.
Exactly.
And so to uncover that there was such a massive sewage problem over there was a problem, but that actually led to a whole series of discoveries, in that there were actually 4 more locations along the creek where sewers were overflowing because they didn't have holding tanks built on them, which was the project that was supposed to have happened in the first place. You didn't even know they were there, which means nobody knew they were there until this investigation even started.
Your plans were to restore the marsh. I want you, if you would, to speak on that period where you could see the restorative efforts had been diminished, actually obliterated, really, yes? Mm-hmm. Too strong a word. So that moment, I'll let you talk about that, and then the plan to move beyond that, I say.
Yes, you would say, but during 2018, basically the sewage had flowed in. There was really no runoff to flush it through, to dilute it. It was such a dry, hot summer, and so you were stuck with this sewage circulating, decomposing, well decomposed, and feeding algae blooms over the course of the summer. The algae basically smothered and took the oxygen from the water, buried other plants, and so from something that was quite extraordinary, we went to nothing except for little pockets back towards Dundas, which was upstream of the issue because still Spencer Creek pushes downstream. It's not almost everything was lost in 2018 that had been gained. Not everything, but almost everything.
Thys, it's very interesting to listen to you because I get a picture, as many probably will do, of a marsh over its evolution in this landscape. We begin to see it, and I love that artists have been coming forward, and you introduce art within the botanical gardens as a way of meaningfully expressing what the marsh is, what an ecological system is. And marshes, artists can express this in ways that perhaps persuade, compel, reshift the mind, the imagination. They can change the paradigm, the eyes that we see with. Right? We have new eyes to see when we're artists, or we consider to think outside the many boxes because that's the nature of an artist. So I love, for instance, the writers that are here in the city who are ecologists, who, like John Terpstra, are writing and unghosting, say, the buried streams. But they are also unghosting our own imagination. So we're beginning to see externally what this poet tells us and gives to us internally. So we begin on an external vision becomes internalized, and we begin to see with the artist. And that is the gift of the artist, to help us to see more clearly. And what I think we have to do in the narrative of Hamilton as artists, as writers, as lovers of this marsh and its tributaries and history, and is to reimagine it, to imagine it as it once was, and to show that, to imagine it and to see it really clearly as it is, its good and its bad, and then maybe to imagine what it could be, what it should be, what we want it to be for our children.
You're right on the money, Martin, and I do want to highlight that we've actually reached a critical point in history that will define perhaps the next 100 years with choices today. There's several major projects now coming together in the troubled Shadok lower end there, where the highway crosses and Main Street crosses and Shadok Creek crosses, all buried, all from a different history. Where the challenge lies is to reimagine it and see the landscape as it once was and can be again, but not see it through engineering, see it through community and outings and environment and experience. So what are these things? Highway 403 has been modified, widened, updated on both sides of Cootes Paradise. But the section in between, which is adjacent to Cootes Paradise, has not had its plans settled. But the other one then, that actually is maybe the key to the whole thing, is the LRT system. Its hub will sit essentially on this nexus of roads at Aberdeen and Frid Street, those sort of areas. These were formerly industrial factory areas. And so how you position and redevelop that location within even the LRT, actually, that defines the future of this area. And during the process of designing all these things that come together, you can either have something that brings back life to the area, or it just continues as an industrial corner of the city.
Wow.
I will say, it really does require the artist community to create that picture that we can visualize.
You know, we spoke of the ancient trails, the ancient roadways. I think there's a name for them, the transits, where they might move across the shoreline, moving north, east and west towards Niagara or back. Or they might be working north and south up on the escarpment. So those trails and transit ways we're walking in indigenous footsteps.
Absolutely. All nations were here, meeting, traveling, fishing, gathering, farming. It's this remarkable piece of history just hidden in front of us, and you have to see it again. It's hidden because our transportation routes just erase the other transportation routes, but they actually are there when you look. The easiest one to experience is actually Snake Road, which runs between Waterdown and the RBG and follows the winding path of the valley. It's a giveaway that it is, because it would have led to a landing on the far corner, the north corner of Cootes Paradise, where it joined the Grindstone Creek Marsh. And there would have been a landing, but the landing was erased by the railway and Plains Road and the bridge. But the route is still there.
I think this is really important that people know that the RBG has taken a leading role, wants to be a leading role, in seeking reconciliation with their indigenous partners. There's a trail there where the Anishinaabe come and they show the plants and how that is medicine. Can you tell me just a bit more?
The trail itself is called the Anishinaabe Wadizewin Trail. It is the trail to indigenous knowledge is what it is. It capitalizes and expresses through the eyes of the Anishinaabe and their words certain medicinal plants in different environments as you walk along it. So there's forest and there's marsh and there's wetland and the whole mix. And it's the medicinal angle. Of course, plants are equally valuable for food as for all of us. We then also married that with what was certainly a traditional route down there. It leads to what is called the RBG boathouse area now, but it's actually really the North Shore landing for boats coming and going to Coots Paradise for generations. The boathouse the RBG has just continues that tradition. During the ceremony to inaugurate the opening of it, I was listening to an elder speak, and it was very much a reconciliation ceremony. They were able to have a place to talk and experience and express off the reservation lands themselves that they had been stuck in, and I had no idea how dramatic that was.
It is a wondrous work you're doing, and I would like it that this program, Tales of Paradise Marsh, and the artists who come here and the others who are respectful and are themselves stewards of the marsh might take from your stories and become allies in a more public and impactful way. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me on, Martin. It's a privilege to come on. It's a fantastic initiative, and I'll come back anytime to tell more stories.
It's a hawk, it's a beauty. Now all of the creatures in the marsh, hawks, herons, foxes, they have a part to play in the story. The herons are the protectors of the marsh, and you'll see them flying over here, lumbering by. They're quite beautiful, graceful birds. They are the protectors, and in the story, the herons are friends of the willows. The willows, as you can see, willows are all over the place, and willows have a really remarkable part in the story. They are, again, a sanctuary for the old ones, and especially for Simon, the young boy who is questing through this journey.